Open design, Kerckhoffs' principle. Opening, the lock whose blueprint is pinned to the door. Auguste Kerckhoffs was a Dutch linguist and cryptographer who in 1883 articulated a principle so contrary to intuition that organizations have been rediscovering it the hard way ever since. He said, in effect, that a military cipher should remain secure even if everything about the system, except the key, is public knowledge. Not just tolerant of disclosure, actually designed for it. The assumption underpinning the cipher should not be that the enemy lacks the blueprints. It should be that the enemy has the blueprints and still cannot break in. Read that a second time, because it does not mean what most people's instincts tell them it means. It does not mean that secrecy is useless. It means that the secrecy you rely on for security must be concentrated in one thing: the key, the credential, the secret, and that thing must be the only thing that needs protecting. Everything else, the algorithm, the protocol, the architecture, the implementation logic, the design decisions, can be public, should be public, and in a well-designed system, benefits from being public because public scrutiny is the most rigorous testing process that exists. This is what open design means as a security principle. It is a design philosophy that says, build your system so that its security does not depend on the attacker's ignorance of how it works. Build it so that a fully informed attacker, one who has read every design document, every protocol specification, every line of your security architecture, still cannot break in without the one thing you're actually protecting. The organizations that have violated this principle throughout history have done so not out of malice, but out of a deeply intuitive and persistently wrong instinct, that telling people less about how your security works makes it harder to attack. The history of cryptography, of software security, of security architecture is full of examples where this instinct led to catastrophe. Custom encryption algorithms that turn out to be trivially breakable once someone looked at them. Proprietary protocols that were treated as secure because nobody outside the vendor had examined them, until someone did. Access control systems that relied on obscured logic that, once reversed, gave attackers a complete roadmap to the authorization bypass. The principle of open design is not a recommendation. It is a lesson extracted from those failures, stated in its most transferable form. What we are building toward in this session is the ability to apply this principle at every layer, in the choice of cryptographic algorithms, in the design of security architectures, in the development of detection logic, in the alignment with security frameworks, and to recognize the specific failure modes that occur when the principle is violated in subtle ways that look like good security practice until they're tested. The foundation, why secrecy of design is a fragile dependency. The principle of open design sits within a cluster of foundational security concepts that are related but distinct, and getting the distinctions precise is what allows the principle to be applied correctly rather than misapplied in ways that undermine it. The first distinction is between the algorithm and the key. This is the structural heart of Kerckhoffs' principle, and it is most clearly expressed in modern cryptography. An encryption algorithm is a mathematical procedure, a set of operations that transforms plain text into ciphertext in a way that is deterministic, reversible with the correct key, and computationally infeasible to reverse without it. AES 256 is one such algorithm. The algorithm itself is completely public. The specification is available to anyone. The mathematical operations it performs are published, analyzed, implemented in thousands of open-source libraries, and scrutinized by cryptographers across the world for over 2 decades. The security of AES 256 does not depend in any way on the secrecy of the algorithm. What it depends on is the secrecy of the key, the 256-bit value that parameterizes the algorithm for a specific encryption operation. 2 parties sharing the key can communicate securely. An attacker who has the ciphertext, the algorithm specification, and everything except the key cannot decrypt the message within any computationally feasible time frame. Symmetric encryption, which AES 256 exemplifies, uses the same key for both encryption and decryption. This creates an efficient cryptographic operation. AES is extremely fast in hardware and software, at the cost of a key distribution problem. The sender and receiver must share the key, which means they must have some prior secure channel through which to exchange it. Asymmetric encryption, exemplified by RSA and the elliptic curve algorithms, solves the key distribution problem by using a mathematically linked pair of keys, a public key that anyone can know and use to encrypt, and a private key that only the owner knows and uses to decrypt. What is encrypted with a public key can only be decrypted with a corresponding private key. The public key can be published openly. It is literally designed to be shared. The security property does not depend on keeping the public key secret. It depends on the mathematical hardness of deriving the private key from the public key, which for correctly sized keys under current computing capabilities is computationally infeasible. Both of these systems are direct embodiments of Kerckhoffs' principle. The algorithms are open. The protocols that use them, TLS, SSH, PGP, are specified in publicly available documents that describe every message, every field, every negotiation step in complete detail. The security is entirely in the keys. The second distinction is between open design and open source. These are related but not identical. Open source means the source code is available for inspection. Open design means the design principles, the algorithmic choices, the architectural decisions are public and have been subjected to peer review. Open source software that embodies well-designed open protocols is a very strong security choice. Linux, OpenSSL, GPG, OpenSSH, because it combines the transparency of the design with the transparency of the implementation, allowing both the mathematical correctness of the algorithm and the correctness of the code that implements it to be independently verified. But open source software that implements a poorly designed, undisclosed proprietary algorithm is not a secure system in the sense Kerckhoffs intended. The source being visible does not help if the algorithm being implemented has not been independently analyzed for cryptographic weakness. The third concept that requires precision is the information security management system and its relationship to open design at the governance layer. An ISMS is the organizational framework that ensures security is managed systematically, that policies exist, that controls are implemented, that risks are assessed, that incidents are handled, and that the entire system is reviewed and improved continuously. ISO 27001 is the most widely adopted framework for building an ISMS, and it is itself an embodiment of open design at the governance level. The standard is publicly available. The control objectives it specifies are documented, debated, and revised by international standards bodies with input from security professionals across the world. An organization that aligns its security controls with ISO 27001 is benefiting from the same principle that AES benefits from. The controls have been examined, challenged, and refined by a large community of practitioners, and their adequacy is not dependent on the organization keeping the framework secret. When different departments in an organization apply a framework like the NIST cybersecurity framework inconsistently, the failure is precisely a failure of open design at the policy level. The framework is open. It defines identify, protect, detect, respond, recover as clear function categories with specific informative references. If the network security team interprets protect as implementing firewalls and the application team interprets it as encrypting stored data without any common mapping between those activities, the organization has not implemented the framework. It has generated local implementations of local interpretations of the framework. The openness of the design requires that the interpretation itself be standardized and documented, that the mapping from framework functions to specific controls be made explicit and shared across the organization, so that the framework's peer-reviewed adequacy can actually be realized rather than assumed. The structural tension: transparency as strength, transparency as risk. The tension inside open design is one that makes practitioners uncomfortable precisely because it runs so directly against a deeply held intuition. The intuition says, the less an attacker knows about your system, the harder it is to attack. The principle says, the less your security depends on what an attacker does not know, the more durable your security is. These are not the same statement, and understanding the distinction between them is the entire intellectual work of internalizing this principle. Security through obscurity is the practice of relying on the secrecy of a system's design or implementation as a primary security control. The proprietary encryption algorithm that the startup has invented and refuses to publish for review is security through obscurity. The access control system whose authorization logic is embedded in compiled code and not documented anywhere is security through obscurity. The network architecture whose firewall rules are not written down because the security team believes that documentation would help an attacker is security through obscurity. In each case, the security property being claimed depends on the attacker not knowing something that could in principle be discovered through reverse engineering, through insider access, through a disgruntled former employee, through a vulnerability in the system that allows the logic to be extracted. The historical record of security through obscurity is not encouraging. DVD encryption relied on the CSS algorithm, which was proprietary and undisclosed. It was broken within months of the DVD format's commercial release, not by a team of expert cryptographers, but by a teenager reverse engineering a software player. The GSM Mobile Network's A5/1 cipher, used to encrypt voice calls, was kept secret by the GSM consortium. Its specification was never officially published. Researchers reverse engineered it from hardware implementations and discovered significant weaknesses that had been present since the algorithm's design, weaknesses that would almost certainly have been caught and corrected during the design process if the algorithm had been subjected to open academic review. Dual ECDRBG, a random number generator algorithm published as a standard by NIST, contained a backdoor that was subsequently attributed to NSA influence, and the backdoor was identified by external researchers examining the public specification, precisely because the specification was open enough to be analyzed. The lesson from each of these is the same. Obscurity delayed discovery of weaknesses but did not prevent it. In the meantime, systems were deployed at scale, depending on security properties that did not actually exist. When the weakness was discovered, the cost was not a temporary inconvenience. It was a systemic compromise of everything that had been protected by the broken system. The other side of the tension is real and must not be dismissed. Not everything that is open is safe to disclose. The specific firewall rules in production, the specific vulnerability scan findings, the specific configuration of a production server. These are operational details whose disclosure provides direct uplift to an attacker without providing any corresponding benefit to the defenders. Kerckhoffs' principle does not say that operational details should be public. It says that the security architecture should not depend on their secrecy. The firewall should be configured to defend correctly even if an attacker knows every rule. The production server should be hardened correctly even if an attacker knows every configuration parameter. The distinction between design transparency and operational detail disclosure is the line that practitioners must hold. Architecture: what systems built on open design actually look like. The architectural expression of open design is the deliberate choice to build security infrastructure on publicly vetted, independently analyzed, widely deployed open standards rather than on proprietary or custom alternatives, and to treat the adoption of open standards not as a compromise, but as a direct security investment. TLS 1.3 is the clearest architectural expression of this principle at the transport layer. Every aspect of the TLS 1.3 protocol is publicly specified in RFC 8446, a document that runs to nearly 90 pages of technical specification, rationale for design decisions, and security considerations. The cipher suites it mandates: AS 256, GCM, CHA 20, Poly 1305, are publicly specified algorithms that have received sustained cryptanalytic attention from academic researchers worldwide. The key exchange mechanisms, ECD-CHI with specific named curves, are mathematically specified and their security properties are formally analyzed. The handshake messages, their ordering, their content, their validation requirements, all of it is public. Any competent attacker who wants to understand TLS 1.3 completely can do so by reading the RFC. And yet TLS 1.3 is considered among the most secure transport protocols in practical deployment, because its security does not derive from obscuring any of this. It derives from the mathematical hardness of the key exchange, from the authenticated encryption of the record layer, and from the elimination of all the weaker legacy mechanisms that TLS 1.2 still supported. Configuring a web server for TLS 1.3 is therefore not merely a technical task. It is a deliberate architectural decision to depend on open design for transport security. The configuration involves selecting only TLS 1.3 compliant cipher suites, generating a certificate through a public CA whose issuance practices are themselves publicly auditable through certificate transparency logs, configuring the server to reject TLS 1.2 and below, and enabling HSDS to prevent protocol downgrade attacks. Each of these steps makes the system's security more dependent on open, vetted mechanisms and less dependent on any assumption about what the attacker does or does not know. The secure development lifecycle in a CI/CD pipeline represents open design at the application layer. SCSD, Static Application Security Testing, is the practice of analyzing source code for security vulnerabilities before it is deployed. The tool examines the code structure, traces data flows from inputs to outputs, and flags patterns that match known vulnerability types. The vulnerability types it is looking for, SQL injection, cross-site scripting, buffer overflow, insecure deserialization, are all documented, analyzed, and publicly described in frameworks like the OWASP Top 10 and the CWE database. The detection logic is not proprietary in the sense that matters for security. It is derived from public knowledge about how these vulnerability classes manifest in code. SCA, Software Composition Analysis, extends this to the dependency graph. A modern application is composed primarily of third-party libraries, and the security of the application depends substantially on the security of those libraries. SCA tools generate a software bill of materials, a complete inventory of every library and its version, and cross-reference that inventory against public vulnerability databases, primarily the NVD and the GitHub Advisory Database, both of which are publicly accessible. The entire security value chain here is built on open design. Public vulnerability disclosures, public databases, public specification of what constitutes a vulnerable dependency. Aligning organizational security controls with ISO 27001 is the governance layer expression of the same principle. The organization is saying, we're not going to invent our own private framework for what constitutes adequate security. We are going to adopt a framework that has been developed, debated, and refined by an international community of security professionals, and we're going to implement it in a way that is auditable against the public standard. The alignment process begins with a gap analysis, comparing the current state of security controls against the standards requirements, and produces a documented treatment plan that maps specific control implementations to specific standard requirements. External auditors can verify the alignment because both sides of the comparison are visible and documented. Tools that enforce open design across the security stack. 4 tools represent the principle of open design at different layers of the security and detection stack, and each one illuminates a different dimension of what transparency as a security property actually means in practice. AES 256 is the canonical exemplar of Kerckhoffs' principle in its purest form. The algorithm's full specification, every substitution box, every key schedule step, every round function is freely available. NIST published AES in 2001 after a 5-year public competition in which 15 candidate algorithms were submitted, analyzed publicly by the global cryptographic community, and progressively eliminated based on published academic attacks and efficiency analyses. The winning algorithm, Rijndal, submitted by Belgian cryptographers Joan Damon and Vincent Rijman, was selected because it withstood the most intense public scrutiny of any cryptographic competition ever conducted. The security of AES 256 is therefore not a claim made by its designers. It is a consensus built from 2 decades of failed attempts by the world's best cryptanalysts to find a practical attack. No classified evaluation, no internal security review, no vendor assurance can replicate the security value that sustained public scrutiny produces. The cost of this openness is essentially zero. The algorithm security does not decrease because its specification is public. The benefit is the highest available confidence that the algorithm does what it claims to do. The limitation is that AES 250 ESXS security assumptions are based on classical computing hardness. Sufficiently powerful quantum computers, implementing Grover's algorithm, could reduce the effective key strength from 256 bits to approximately 128 bits. Still computationally infeasible in practice, but the trajectory toward post-quantum cryptography is already a governance consideration for systems with long-term confidentiality requirements. Linux, as an open-source operating system with a publicly available kernel, embodies open design at the implementation layer in a way that closed-source operating systems structurally cannot. The Linux kernel source code is publicly readable by anyone. Security researchers, independent auditors, and thousands of contributors examine it continuously. Vulnerabilities are discovered, reported, and patched through a public process. CVs are filed, patches are published. The fix is visible and verifiable. This does not mean Linux is free of vulnerabilities. It means that the security of a correctly configured Linux system does not depend on any assumption that the kernel's internals are unknown to an attacker. The security comes from the configuration, from correctly implementing least privilege, from appropriate hardening of services, from timely patching, from correct file system permissions. An attacker who reads the Linux kernel source code does not gain any special advantage over an attacker who has not, because the configuration that provides the security is specific to each deployment. The cost of this transparency is that the same public source code that allows defenders to find and fix vulnerabilities also allows attackers to study the code for attack paths. The benefit is that the defender community is orders of magnitude larger than the attacker community for this purpose, and the defensive value of the scrutiny substantially exceeds the offensive value of the same transparency. OIDC and SAML are open authentication and federation protocols that demonstrate open design at the identity layer. Both protocols are specified in public documents. SAML in a set of OASIS specifications, OIDC in an OpenID Foundation specification built on top of the IETF's OAuth 2.0 framework. Both have been implemented by hundreds of identity providers, service providers, and security products. Both have been analyzed for vulnerabilities by security researchers who publish their findings publicly. XML signature wrapping attacks against SML, token substitution attacks against OAuth, redirect URI validation failures in OIDC. These are known, documented, publicly described vulnerability classes that the protocol specifications have been updated to address and that every competent implementer can check for. The security of a SAML-based SSO deployment does not depend on the attacker not knowing how SAML works. It depends on the implementation correctly handling the known attack vectors, which are visible and documented. The cost is that implementing these protocols correctly requires understanding the known attack classes and not cutting corners on validation. The limitation is that protocol security depends on implementation quality. A correctly specified protocol implemented with subtle validation errors is still vulnerable, and the openness of the protocol does not compensate for implementation mistakes. YRA rules are the expression of open design in threat detection, and they represent something philosophically important: the deliberate choice to make detection logic transparent and shareable rather than treating it as a proprietary competitive advantage. A Y-array rule is a set of conditions, strings, byte patterns, file structure properties that identify a piece of malware or a class of malicious behavior. The rule is human-readable, documented, and easily shared. The threat intelligence community shares YRA rules through public repositories, through ISACs, through vendor threat intelligence feeds. When a malware analyst discovers a new threat and writes a YRA rule to detect it, publishing that rule allows every organization that receives it to detect the same threat, regardless of whether they have their own malware analysis capability. The open design of YRA rules multiplies defensive capability across the community in a way that proprietary, undisclosed detection signatures cannot. The cost is that the same transparency that allows defenders to share detection logic allows attackers to test their samples against public YRA rules and modify them until the detection no longer fires. A direct example of the adversarial dynamic that open design creates. The response to this cost is the principle of detection depth. No single YRA rule should be the sole detection mechanism for a threat, and the most resilient rules target behaviors and characteristics that are expensive for attackers to change, not surface-level strings that are trivial to modify. Implementation. Applying the principle where it is most often violated. Two implementation scenarios demonstrate open design being applied in contexts where the alternative, a proprietary or obscurity-dependent approach, is tempting and superficially attractive. The first is the TLS 1.3 configuration on a web server that handles authentication for a financial services application. The starting point is an existing deployment running TLS 1.2 with a broad cipher suite list that includes several weaker options. Our cipher has already been removed, but CBC mode cipher suites remain, and session renegotiation is still enabled. The security team has been asked to harden the configuration to TLS 1.3 only, and the application team has raised a concern. Some corporate clients still run legacy systems that do not support TLS 1.3 and will lose connectivity if TLS 1.2 is disabled entirely. The implementation begins with a certificate request. The certificate is obtained from a publicly trusted CA, not a self-signed certificate, not an internally trusted CA root, but a CA whose root certificate is embedded in all major browser and operating system trust stores, and whose issuance practices are auditable through certificate transparency logs. The CSR specifies the correct subject alternative names for all domains the server will serve, and the signature algorithm is ECDSAP 256 or RSA 2048, not legacy MD5 or SHA. One signatures are no longer trusted by modern clients. This is open design at the certificate layer. The trust chain is publicly verifiable by anyone who wants to verify it. The cipher suite configuration eliminates everything that is not a TLS 1.3 defined cipher suite. TLS 1.3 mandates a specific shortlist. TLS 128 GCMSHA 256. TLS 256 GCMSHA 384. And Tolskacha 20 Poly 1305 _ SHA 256. All three are EAD cipher suites. Authenticated encryption with associated data, which means they provide both confidentiality and integrity in a single cryptographic operation, eliminating the class of padding oracle attacks that affected CBC mode ciphers. The open specification of these suites is what makes the cipher configuration decision defensible. The reasoning is publicly documented, the security properties are formally analyzed, and any auditor can verify that the choices are correct against public standards. The legacy client concern is addressed through a time-bounded transition plan rather than an indefinite exception. The clients that cannot support TLS 1.3 are inventoried. Their upgrade timelines are confirmed with the client organizations, and a deadline is set, 90 days, after which TLS 1.2 support will be removed. During the 90-day window, TLS 1.2 is supported, but with a restricted cipher suite list that eliminates CBC modes and requires ECDC key exchange for perfect forward secrecy. The decision, the timeline, and the rationale are documented in the risk register with the CISO's sign-off, making the residual risk explicit and owned rather than implicit and unmanaged. The second implementation is the alignment of security controls with ISO 27001 for an organization that currently has no formal security framework. The first step, the gap analysis, is where open design's value at the governance layer is most visible. The ISO 27001 annex a control set is public. The organization maps each of its current security practices to the corresponding Annex A controls and identifies the gaps. Controls that are missing entirely, controls that are partially implemented, and controls that are implemented but not documented or not reviewed. The output is a gap analysis report that shows, control by control, what the current state is and what is required to reach compliance. The reason this process is more valuable than the organization inventing its own security framework is exactly the reason ES 256 is more valuable than a custom encryption algorithm. The standard has been subjected to scrutiny that no internal development process can replicate. ISO 27001 Annex. It represents the accumulated judgment of international standards bodies about what an adequate information security management system requires. Implementing it correctly means benefiting from that scrutiny. But implementing it correctly requires understanding the controls at the level of specific, measurable implementation, not at the level of checking a box. The implementation of a control like a 0.9.4.2 secure logon procedures requires more than acknowledging that secure login is a good idea. It requires documenting the specific mechanisms, MFA requirement, session timeout policy, failed login lockout threshold, reauthentication for sensitive operations, and confirming that each mechanism is implemented, tested, and reviewed on a defined schedule. When different departments implement this control differently, the IT team requiring MFA but not enforcing session timeouts, the operations team enforcing session timeouts but not requiring MFA, the inconsistency is both a security failure and an audit finding because the control cannot be demonstrated to be consistently implemented across the organization's scope. When open design is violated, 3 diagnostic scenarios. 3 failure scenarios surface the specific ways in which deviations from open design create vulnerabilities, and the diagnostic path for each reveals something different about where the principle was violated and what restoring it requires. The first scenario is the application that uses client certificate authentication for API access and suddenly fails with a client certificate not trusted error, despite the client certificate appearing to be valid. It is not expired. It shows the correct subject, and it was issued by the organization's internal CA. This is a failure in the trust chain, and diagnosing it requires tracing the chain from the leaf certificate through every intermediate to the root. The first check is the server's trust store. Client certificate authentication requires the server to trust the CA that issued the client certificate. If the server's trust store contains only the root CA and the client certificate was issued by an intermediate CA, the server cannot build the chain from the client certificate to the trusted root without the intermediate CA certificate. The error will look identical to a completely untrusted certificate, even though the chain is technically valid and the intermediate is itself signed by the trusted root. The fix is to include the intermediate CA certificate in the server's trust store or to configure the server to accept certificate chains where the issuing CA is itself signed by a trusted root. The diagnostic step is to pull the full certificate chain from the client and trace each link. Leaf certificate issuer matches intermediate CA subject. Intermediate CA issuer matches root CA subject. Root CA is present in the server's trust store. The second check is CRL or OCSP reachability. The server may be configured to perform revocation checking, a correct and important security control, and the CRL distribution point or OCSP responder URL embedded in the client certificate may be unreachable. This is a particularly common failure in environments where the internal CA's CRL distribution point uses an internal host name that is not resolvable from the server performing the check, or where the OCSP responder is behind a firewall that the server cannot traverse. The certificate is valid and unrevoked, but the server cannot confirm this and fails the connection. The diagnostic step is to attempt to reach the CRL distribution point and OCSP responder URL from the server. A simple curl command against the URL will determine whether the endpoint is reachable and responding. The fix is either to make the revocation endpoint reachable or to configure the server to handle unreachable revocation endpoints gracefully, with an appropriate policy decision about whether to fail open or fail closed when revocation status cannot be confirmed. The third check is certificate chain order in the client's presented chain. A well-formed client certificate presentation should include the leaf certificate followed by any intermediate CA certificates in order from leaf to root. If the client is presenting the certificates in the wrong order or omitting the intermediate entirely and expecting the server to reconstruct it, some server implementations will reject the chain as malformed even if all the individual certificates are valid. The diagnostic step is to examine the raw TLS handshake with a packet capture tool, extracting the certificate messages and verifying the order and completeness of the presented chain. The second scenario is a YRA rule that suddenly begins generating 100 times its normal alert volume overnight. The question is whether this is a genuine spike in the threat the rule is designed to detect, a change in the environment that is causing legitimate files to match the rule, or a flaw in the rule itself that was exposed by a change in the sample set the rule is evaluated against. The diagnostic begins by examining what changed overnight. Pull the deployment log for any software updates, configuration pushes, or new file installations that occurred in the window before the alert volume increased. A software update that deploys a new version of a legitimate application may have introduced files containing the string or byte pattern the YRA rule targets. If the rule was written against characteristics that are present in both malicious and legitimate files. This is a rule quality failure. The rule was not sufficiently specific to distinguish malicious from benign instances of the target characteristic. If no deployment change is visible, the diagnostic shifts to the sample set. What files are triggering the rule? Pull a representative sample of the alert-generating files and examine them. Are they all from the same directory, the same application, the same file type? If the rule is designed to detect a specific IoT malware family that uses XOR obfuscation with a fixed key, and the alert spike is coming from a newly deployed network monitoring tool that happens to contain the same XOR key in its binary. The rule needs a condition that excludes the legitimate tool. A Y-array rule refined to add a condition. The XOR key is present and the binary does not contain the signing certificate of the legitimate vendor. Eliminates the false positives without losing detection coverage for the malicious family. The deeper diagnostic question is why the rule was written without that exclusion condition in the first place. Y-array rules written against specific observable characteristics without considering the population of legitimate files that may share those characteristics will produce false positives at scale. Building Y-array rules with deliberate precision, testing against a known clean file corpus before deployment, reviewing against threat intelligence to understand what characteristics are actually unique to the malicious family, is the quality standard that prevents this scenario from recurring. The third scenario is the team of security engineers at a government agency evaluating a vendor's proposal for a custom encryption algorithm that the vendor claims is more efficient and more secure than AES 256, but whose specification the vendor declines to publish on the grounds of protecting their intellectual property. The red flag is the claim that the algorithm cannot be published for review because it is proprietary, and the diagnostic question is not whether the algorithm might be good. It is whether any confidence in its goodness can be established without public scrutiny. The evaluation process applies exactly the reasoning Kerckhoffs articulated. An algorithm whose security properties cannot be independently verified by cryptographers who do not work for the vendor is an algorithm whose security properties cannot be trusted, regardless of what the vendor claims. The vendor's internal testing, however thorough, represents a far smaller attack surface than sustained public cryptanalysis. The history of custom or undisclosed cryptographic algorithms, CSS, a 5/1, the dual EC-DRBG backdoor, shows that weaknesses in undisclosed algorithms are not hypothetical. They are expected. The algorithms that have resisted sustained attack are the ones that were designed under public scrutiny and tested by adversaries who had every incentive to find weaknesses. The recommendation is to reject the proprietary algorithm and to require that any cryptographic primitives used in the agency's infrastructure be publicly specified, independently analyzed by at least 2 credible external cryptographic research groups, and implemented in open-source libraries with a public track record. The vendor can still participate in the engagement. They may have legitimate value to offer in protocol design, system integration, or key management infrastructure, but the cryptographic core of the system must be built on publicly vetted mathematics. The mitigation for the agency's concern about long-term quantum resistance is cipher agility, designing the integration layer so that the cryptographic primitive can be replaced with a post-quantum algorithm from the NIST PQC standardization process, all of which are fully public, without requiring changes to the application logic that uses it. 3 roles, 3 encounters with the principal. 3 roles encounter open design at different layers and at different moments, and the specific skill each needs to apply the principle correctly is different in each case. The security architect encounters open design at the most consequential moment in the system's life cycle before it is built. The architect who is designing the authentication system for a new cloud-native application faces a choice between adopting OIDC, a publicly specified, widely deployed, independently analyzed protocol, and implementing a custom token-based authentication system that the development team has already prototyped because they found the OIDC implementation libraries more complex to configure than a simple JWT signing service they built themselves. The architect's job in this moment is to translate the principle into a business argument that the development team can evaluate, not to issue a mandate. The custom JWT signing service the team built has probably been tested for the happy path. It issues tokens, the tokens are validated, the authentication flow works. What has not been tested is whether the JWT validation correctly handles algorithm confusion attacks, where an attacker changes the token's algorithm field from RS-256 to HS-256 and signs it with the server's public key, which is typically available. What has not been tested is whether the token issuer correctly validates the audience claim, preventing tokens issued for one service from being accepted by a different service. What has not been tested is whether the key rotation procedure, when the signing key is eventually compromised, can be executed without downtime. These are not exotic attack vectors. They are documented vulnerability classes in JWT implementations, published in public security research, present in the OWASP API Security Top 10. The OIDC libraries the development team found complex to configure handle all of them correctly because they were written by people who had read that research. The custom implementation has none of that scrutiny history. The architect translates this into a concrete risk statement, implementing custom authentication logic rather than using a vetted open standard creates a set of known, documented vulnerability classes that the team's testing has not covered. Adopting OIDC eliminates those classes by construction. The configuration complexity is a one-time cost. The security debt of the custom implementation compounds with every deployment. The malware analyst encounters open design from the adversarial direction in the analysis of malware that is specifically designed to evade detection by avoiding characteristics that open Y-array rules target. A custom packer that encrypts the malware payload and decrypts it at runtime produces a binary that does not contain the strings, byte patterns, or import table entries that the detection rules look for. The analyst's task is to understand what the packer is doing and extract signatures that will detect it despite the obfuscation. The first step is static analysis on the packed binary. Even without the decrypted payload, the packer itself has characteristics. The import table will typically contain only a small number of functions, since the packer handles the full import resolution dynamically. The binary's entropy will be high, reflecting the encrypted payload. The section names may be non-standard or absent. These characteristics are themselves signalable in a Y-array rule targeting the packer family rather than the payload. The second step is dynamic analysis to observe the unpacking behavior. Running the sample in a sandbox that captures API calls, memory writes, and network activity shows the packer allocating memory, decrypting the payload into the new memory region, and transferring execution. The decrypted payload becomes visible in memory and can be extracted for static analysis. The resulting Y-array rule targets the decrypted payload's characteristics, strings, import patterns, code structure, which will match the payload whenever it appears in memory, regardless of which packer was used to conceal it. The principle being applied is that obfuscation of a binary surface characteristics does not change the payload's behavioral characteristics, and detection that targets behavior is more resilient to evasion than detection that targets surface attributes. The security data engineer encounters open design at the pipeline layer, where the question is not what cryptographic algorithm or detection rule to use, but whether the pipeline's own logic is transparent and auditable. A security data pipeline that ingests honeypot telemetry, enriches it, aggregates it, and generates reports has security properties that depend on the correctness and integrity of its processing logic. If that logic is opaque, undocumented functions, no tests, no validation layer, then the pipeline security outputs cannot be trusted by the people who consume them, because there is no way to verify that the outputs correctly represent the underlying data. The design that fails is the pipeline that produces a JSON report and delivers it to a downstream consumer without any validation step. When the downstream consumer, a dashboard rendering attack statistics, receives a JSON file with a trailing comma from a manual edit, the parse fails, the dashboard shows stale data, and the failure is invisible until someone notices that the numbers have not changed. The hardening step is a validation layer that reads every generated output file, attempts to parse it against the expected schema, and rejects or quarantines malformed outputs before they reach any consumer. The validation layer is itself a form of open design at the pipeline level. It makes the expected structure of the output explicit and machine checkable, rather than relying on the assumption that the generation process will always produce correct output. Any future change to the generation logic that produces output inconsistent with the schema will be caught at the validation step, rather than silently propagated to downstream consumers. Case scenario: the encryption algorithm that wasn't. The scenario is this. A security startup approaches the procurement team of a mid-sized government agency with a proposal. The startup claims to have developed a novel encryption algorithm, they call it SecureX, that achieves 512-bit equivalent security at a fraction of the computational cost of ES 256. Their product brochure cites benchmarks showing throughput double that of AES 256, GCM at equivalent key sizes. The price point is attractive. The startup's founders have credible backgrounds. Two of them have PhD credentials in mathematics from reputable institutions. The procurement team is interested and routes the proposal to the security architecture group for evaluation. The constraint is that the agency has a live procurement cycle closing in 6 weeks, and the communications infrastructure the new cryptographic solution would protect must be operational within a quarter. The business case for the faster algorithm is real. The agency's data transfer requirements have grown beyond what their current hardware can handle at EES speeds without adding costly hardware acceleration. The pressure to find a solution is genuine. The security architecture group begins the evaluation with the principles it always applies to cryptographic component selection. The first question is the algorithm's specification publicly available? The startup declines to provide the full specification, citing trade secret protection. They offer instead a technical summary describing the algorithm structure at a high level and a set of benchmark results from tests conducted by the startup's own engineering team. The second question is, has the algorithm been evaluated by independent cryptographers? The startup provides a letter from a consulting cryptographer, a single individual, who has reviewed the algorithm under NDA and attests that it appears sound. The third question is there an implementation in a publicly available library with an established security track record? No. The only implementation is the startup's own closed-source library. The security architecture group presents its evaluation to the CISO. The assessment is negative, and the reasoning is structured around each of the three questions. A proprietary algorithm whose specification is not public cannot be trusted to be secure because the trust property of a cryptographic algorithm is not the designer's assurance. It is the community's failed attempts to break it. A single consulting cryptographer reviewing under NDA is not a substitute for sustained open academic analysis. The benchmark results, conducted by the startup's own team, are not evidence of cryptographic strength. They are evidence of implementation speed. Speed and security are orthogonal properties. A simple XOR cipher is faster than AES 256 and provides no security whatsoever. The architecture group recommends three alternatives. The first is hardware acceleration for AES 256. GCM using ASNI instructions, which are present in all modern Intel and AMD processors and provide AES performance approaching the theoretical limits of the cipher, typically 4 to 8 gigabytes per second per core in software, which exceeds the agency's current transfer requirements. This is the lowest risk path. The same algorithm implemented in hardware, running at the required speed. The second is Cha-Cha-20 Poly 1305, which is designed to be fast in software without hardware acceleration, is specified in RFC 8439, and has been independently analyzed by multiple research groups. It was adopted in TLS 1.3 as a first-class cipher suite precisely for environments where AES hardware acceleration is not available. The third is to accelerate the hardware procurement timeline, adding ASNI-capable hardware to the existing infrastructure, rather than replacing the cryptographic primitive. The CISO approves the first recommendation, and the hardware acceleration deployment is completed within the quarter. 6 months later, a security researcher publishes a paper demonstrating that SecureX is a linear feedback shift register with a key derivation function layered on top, a construction that is fundamentally weak and can be broken with approximately 2,000 known plaintext using basic statistical analysis. The paper calculates that an attacker with access to 2,000 encrypted messages and their corresponding plaintext can recover the key in under 4 seconds on consumer hardware. If the agency had deployed SecureX across its communications infrastructure, every message encrypted with it during the deployment period would be retroactively compromised at the moment the attack became public. The architecture group documents the outcome in a lessons learned report. The key finding is not that the startup was dishonest. They may have genuinely believed their algorithm was secure. The finding is that the belief of the algorithm's designers is irrelevant to the security of the algorithm. What matters is whether the algorithm has withstood attempts to break it by people who had both the capability and the incentive to find weaknesses. Open design provides the conditions under which such attempts occur. Proprietary secrecy prevents them. The agency's evaluation framework is updated to include a mandatory requirement that any cryptographic primitive used in agency infrastructure must have a publicly available specification and at least 2 independent peer-reviewed analyses by research groups with no financial relationship to the algorithm's developer. The requirement is not negotiable regardless of procurement timeline pressure. The architecture group also documents the cipher agility design pattern as a standing recommendation for all new systems. The communications infrastructure deployed with ES 256 GCM is designed so that the cipher suite is configurable without application code changes. When a NIST post-quantum cryptography standardization process completes, it has been running publicly since 2016, with all candidate algorithms and their cryptanalysis fully visible to any interested researcher. The agency will be able to migrate to the standardized post-quantum algorithm by updating a configuration parameter rather than rebuilding the application. The migration path is part of the design from the beginning, because the history of cryptography makes clear that no algorithm is permanent. The correct response to that reality is not to find an algorithm that will never be broken. It is to build systems that can gracefully adopt the next vetted algorithm when the time comes. Closing. The confidence that only scrutiny can provide. There is a version of security confidence that is easy to produce and worthless. The confidence of someone who has not been tested. A lock that nobody has tried to pick appears to work perfectly. An algorithm that nobody has analyzed appears to be unbreakable. A system designed in private and deployed without external review appears to be sound. The appearance holds until the first competent adversary arrives. There is another version of security confidence that is hard to produce and genuinely valuable. The confidence of something that has survived sustained, intelligent, adversarial scrutiny. AES 256 does not merely claim to be secure. It has resisted 2 decades of attempts by the world's best cryptanalysts to break it, and those attempts were conducted in public, with a methodology published, so that the community could verify not just that the attacks failed, but that the attacks were competent. TLS 1.3 does not merely claim to be a secure transport protocol. Its design was debated in public for years. Its weaknesses were identified and corrected through open academic exchange, and its final specification reflects that process. The security professional who internalizes this principle develops a specific reflex: skepticism toward any security claim that cannot be externally verified. Not hostility, skepticism. The vendor who says their system is secure because they designed it carefully deserves a follow-up question. How do you know? The answer that we tested it internally and we are confident in our team's expertise is not the same answer as we published the design and researchers have been trying to break it for 5 years. The first answer tells you something about the vendor's confidence. The second tells you something about the system's actual security. The disposition that open design builds is the habit of asking, for every security claim, where does the trust come from, and is that source of trust independent of the party making the claim? The answer to that question determines whether the security you are building will hold when the adversary arrives fully informed, which they always eventually do. End of session. Open design. Kerckhoffs' principle.